Let's look at the slides here. This is very interesting. I think the analysis of this here gives you a huge opening for you to think about America based on what I said in one of the 5 questions. Very interesting here. Imagine a student who looks at this map here, thinks about the population. He can watch a lot of television, a lot of documentaries. He doesn't travel, but he can see documentaries. He knows more or less the population of the whole of America. So he already imagines that population, those people from that region over there. And then one day the guy is going to take a test. It seems like a question like that. Characterize the labor force mostly used in Bahia. He never studied about colonization and labor, but he is a person who has seen this table. He thinks and responds. Black slave labor. Let's see if he got it right. Here comes another question. Characterize the majority workforce present in the colonization of Maranhão. The guy stopped, thought. Another question comes. Characterize the predominant labor used on the island of Hispaniola, Cuba, during Spanish colonization. And then to close, characterize the labor used in the colonization of the New Spain. Let's just close the space of the New Spain, which is big, Mexico. These 4 questions, this student would answer without having attended a class on colonization and colonial labor in any of these regions, only having in his mind a documentary about these populations in these regions. What did I notice here? Where does a particular ethnicity predominate in America? That's the rule, it's standard, it has exceptions. In general, you see the population, you look at the majority ethnic group walking on the streets, you can find out which workforce was used during the colonial period. So the questions I asked, for example, would you talk about Maranhão? In Maranhão you see the strong presence of the Indian. If you stop, the same thing, the strong presence of the Indian population. So it assumes that the majority of labor used in that region was that of the Indian. Then you go to Bahia. You ask the same question, black slave labor. Then you go to Cuba, Rio Grande do Sul. Rio Grande do Sul even had a black presence, but not so much. There are those exceptions that we see. For example, in Argentina, some parts of Rio Grande do Sul, you will have a much greater presence of immigrants. The role of immigrants will play a very large role there in this region, in Argentina mainly. So in Argentina, after the War of the Rock, called the War of the Desert, you have almost an ethnic cleansing in Argentina, a cluster of indigenous people there in that southern part that almost disappears the presence of the Indian in a strong process of Europeanization in Argentina. So we can say that Argentina is one of those exceptions, but if you take the rest of America, Bolivia, Peru, the presence is very strong of the element that was the majority. Well, weren't there a lot of Indians in Brazil too? It existed, but this Indian was not important. If he was not important, the extermination of this Indian was not something fought. Because when we talk about extermination, it's not necessarily just direct death. We talk about the extermination of Indians in America. This is an important thing that I think you should also know. We have 3 explanatory factors for the extermination of Indians in America at that initial moment. 3 factors, forced labor, and then it includes forced labor, the very issue of abortions, which was very common. The mother aborting the child precisely because she does not want the child to be born due to the conditions in which she is exposed. This is very common. So we can call forced labor, and we include this model. Direct murder, which happened a lot, direct murder, and the biological factor. Incredible as it may seem, the factor that most exterminated Indians was not direct murder, nor forced labor. Direct murder killed the least number of Indians. What killed the most was the biological factor, and the biological factor was not intentional. There was no intention to kill the Indian. This was due to a natural issue, due to the isolation of this indigenous group in relation to Europe and Africa. They did not have natural defenses against simple, silly diseases, which the European arrived here with a sneeze. They ended up with an entire village. And the interesting thing is that you see in the reports the Spaniards concerned to save these indigenous people. He was worried. He didn't want to kill Indians. On the contrary, he was worried about finding out what was causing all that mortality.
Why?
Because this workforce is important to him. If she is important, he will try to preserve it. So where labor is important, it will generally be preserved. That is why the indigenous presence in regions where there was a strong indigenous workforce, it persists in the population until today. You see it in Mexico, you see it in Bolivia, you see it in Peru, you see it in regions further north of our territory, like Para, even Maranhão there in the Amazon, that region there where there were drugs in the Sertão, the Jesuit missions that were very strongly present. There you will have in the population today, demographically, a presence of these elements. Here we can see, the region of Mexico, we have in 1825, around 4.5 million indigenous people in this region. In the Caribbean there is no such information, in Spanish South America 3.2 million. When we go to Brazil, look how it decreases, 0.4, very little. This is the result of the analysis we just did here. Then you think about white people, 2 million in Mexico, 0.1 in the Caribbean region, in Spanish America 1.4, here in Brazil 0.9. Look at the miscegenation process here, very strong in Brazil. This is very good for us to reason a lot about this ethnic formation in America today based on history.